Welcome to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast talk radio. I'm your host today, Alison Weir, CNI board member and director of If Americans Knew. This show is a project of the CNI Foundation, which works for fair U.S. policies in the Middle East and fair discussion of those policies here in America. Find out more about us at our website, www.cnionline.org, or on our new blog, Fair Policy, Fair Discussion. Our guest on the show today is Gideon Levy, an award-winning columnist for the Israeli daily newspaper Haaretz. Gideon, I am sure, is known to many of you. He is a long-time Israeli journalist, and since 1988 he has been writing a searing column called The Twilight Zone, in which he describes the situation of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. His columns are profoundly honest and consistently moving, as he makes Palestinians and their condition real for an Israeli public and a world whose preference might be not to know. In fact, one of his themes is that he is writing so that Israelis will not be able to say, "We didn't know." I first interviewed Mr. Levy about 2 years ago when I visited his office at Haaretz, and I am very excited to be speaking with him again today. Welcome to the show, Gideon. I'm delighted to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
I'd like to start with a little of your own personal history. You are a major commentator in Israel. I believe history will show you to be quite an important person. So I think that our listeners would like to know more about your background. For many years, as you've written, you were, quote, a full member of the nationalistic religious orgy. What exactly did you mean by that very strong phrase? And when and how did you abandon your membership in it?
Yeah, I'm speaking about the first days after the 67 war. I was then a teenager. I was part of the Israeli consensus, namely feeling that we liberated, so-called, the occupied territories. We saw only the so-called holy places without seeing the Palestinian inhabitants who lived there. We were totally blind there and totally taken by this really miraculous victory of Israel in 67, which turned to become the biggest tragedy of Israel.
I've understood that to be an extremely exciting time in Israel, and I think for the Jewish population in the United States as well. Apparently people were overwhelmed with that victory without realizing really what it meant.
Yeah, absolutely, because for weeks and months we were brainwashed to think that Israel is in existentialistic danger, that a second Holocaust might appear, and then this really miraculous victory in 6 days, 7 days, this left us in this orgy, as I call it, or ecstasy.
I've always been curious about the situation for Israelis because certainly in the United States, we are aware, much more than we were when I was growing up in the 1950s, about what was actually done to the indigenous population here, to the Native Americans who lived here before the Europeans arrived, the injustice and the violence that was done. And yet in Israel, I wonder, how aware are people about what was done, really within my lifetime? We're not talking a few hundred years ago. Growing up, what did you think about the Palestinians who had lived there?
No, none of us paid any attention to this. We were totally brainwashed and totally convinced that those Palestinians, they all left in 48 out of their own will, and because of their own responsibility. There was no moral question about this. Unfortunately, until today, I think that the big majority of Israelis have no moral doubts about what happened in 48.
You did grow to have very profound moral doubts about that. Can you describe to us when those began and how that happened?
It happened when I started to travel to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip, which is quite unusual for most of the Israelis who never go there. Back in the late 80s, as I started as a journalist to travel to the West Bank and to Gaza and to see what occupation means for 3.5 million people. This took some time until I really understood that the real drama of Israel is taking place in its dark backyard, a place where no Israeli journalist is present and no Israeli reader or TV watcher has any interest in. And ever since then, I'm there.
When you did those early trips, were you at first shocked by it? Did you refuse to believe it?
No, it's a very gradual process. It was not shocking. It was a gradual process of understanding what's going on. And I was shocked many times, but it's not a story of light and darkness. It's more a story of ongoing process of witnessing, documenting, and understanding what is the real nature of Israel and what is being done on my behalf as an Israeli.
Now that you have come to that understanding and you write really these truly searing, very powerful depictions about what is going on, describing Palestinian children who have been killed, people living in complete devastation, writing about those in your column. And I know that you've come under considerable attack for your writings. You're called, quote, Israel's most radical commentator. I think you once joked that, quote, somewhere in Haaretz's newsroom there exists a thick file of notifications by regular readers canceling their subscriptions after reading your articles. What's it like for you living in Israel as you work in Haaretz, where I know not everyone shares your views, as you walk down the street in your own neighborhood? Is this difficult for you, or do people just accept that those are your views?
Listen, it's not very easy, but I'm quite used to it. It's so many years and it's going on. Let's remember that Israel finally is not Russia, and at least until now, journalists can raise their voice without being assassinated. In many cases, it's unpleasant. There is a lot of inconvenience. People might insult me in the street, but in the same time, there are also so many fans of what I do. And I don't think I am the real story. I mean, I'm not a victim, by all means not. And I am doing my job, and my newspaper enables me full freedom. I pay some price, and I gain a lot as well.
The Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who, of course, has written extremely important books. Most recently, I believe the title was The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Eventually, he gave up being a professor in Israel and moved to England, I believe, about a year or two ago. You don't anticipate doing something like that yourself, I take it?
No, I will never leave Israel as long as I can stay here, because that's the arena where I want to fight and where I have to struggle. And finally, I'm a journalist, and I can write only in Hebrew. This is my mission, this is my job, and we'll continue it as long as it is possible. I never left Israel, and I have no plans to leave Israel.
I think many of us feel, certainly about in the U.S., feel that way about our own nation, that it's our responsibility to stay here and try to inform our public and inform and change what our government is doing. I had ended the last segment asking Gideon about a technical point I've always been curious about how he writes his column, which I believe is published both in Hebrew and in English. Do you write it in both, and do you write it in one language first and translate it? Is it exactly the same in both languages?
I write only in Hebrew, and the Haaretz has a lot of stuff of translators who translate most of the newspaper, not all of it. I am privileged enough to be always translated, but I have nothing to do with the translation. I think they are doing a good job, but I don't follow it so carefully as long as I don't see any problems about it.
Many of our listeners don't know, and I certainly did not know, that when we go to the website and read Haaretz in English, that all of the newspaper is not available to us. There are some stories that are not being posted there. I'm guessing that many times these are just stories of just very local interest. But I'm wondering if that's not always the case. I remember when I was there about 2 years ago, there had been a story in the Israeli version about the military censorship that Israeli and other journalists really have to operate within. There was an editorial in Hebrew about the fact that there is such censorship, and yet it was not on the website in English. Is this something you can discuss? Do you know anything about what's going on with that?
Yeah, I know that it has nothing to do neither with ideology nor with censorship. It's all about impossible time pressure when the deadline is so tied up and you have to translate 3/4 of a newspaper in the same evening. I mean, it's unprecedented. A newspaper which appears on the same day in both languages. Don't look for any kind of conspiracy. It's all about technical problems.
That's reassuring. We wonder, because certainly in the U.S., often things that are missing and that are taken out of news reports, I feel often that there is a pattern in U.S. news coverage. It's wonderful, Gideon, having you online, because there are so many things about Israel that you have access to that the rest of us don't know about. For example, in, I believe from about 1978 to 1982, you served along with Yossi Beilin as an aide to Shimon Peres, Israeli officials whose views and actions are really very different than your own. Do you ever have contact with them anymore? And what are these men like? Is their moral universe just different than perhaps yours and mine? Do they just not think in terms of morality? Or can you tell us a little bit about Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin?
First of all, I was then much younger, much more innocent, much more brainwashed. I knew so little. I don't think I could have served in the same position today. And if I would have served in the same position, I think I would have raised my voice in a totally different way than then. When you are in your 20s, a student in the university, and you are privileged to have this opportunity to work already with the legendary then Shimon Peres, then it's one thing, and if I would have had the opportunity to do it today, it would be a different thing. I'm very critical about Shimon Peres. I think that he is really one of the problems of Israel in terms of showing the so-called beautiful face of Israel for the world, while Israel is doing all those ugly things. I think he's misleading. I think he practically did very little to implement all the good ideas that he's speaking about them. And I think that he carries a very heavy responsibility for what's going on today, above all to the biggest project of Israel, the settlement project. He was one of the founding fathers of this project. So I'm very critical of him today, and I express it in many articles. But I don't ask myself, why did I work with him then? Because then I was also a different person. Only today I can understand what I didn't understand when I was in my 20s.
I'd like to open the line, and we'll begin with James from New York. James?
Yes, I was a pilgrim with CNI for the trip they had this year in May and June. It was certainly illuminating for me. One of the complete surprises was what was going on in East Jerusalem as far as the move to get Christians out, which is something I don't think people in the U.S. know very much about, especially the Christian right. They just assume this is an Israeli-Arab thing. But I was surprised at some of the numbers that were being tossed around as far as the amount of Christians that have been forced out by various decrees and that type of thing. And I wondered if you could comment on that and if you had any recent numbers on the amount of Christians that have been forced to leave.
Unfortunately not. I don't think that Israel makes any difference between the Christian and the Muslim Palestinians. Basically, Israel did take some steps in the last years not to evacuate Palestinians from East Jerusalem, but to take their civil rights in Jerusalem, namely to cancel their papers. And in the last years, thousands of Palestinians had to leave Jerusalem because they couldn't prove that they deserve Israeli ID, which you need to have in order to live in East Jerusalem. I don't think that there is any kind of differentiation between Muslim and Christians. I think Israel is doing anything possible to bring more Jews to East Jerusalem and to try to get rid of as many as Palestinians as possible.
You know, those tactics are very reminiscent for me of something I saw in my earlier life. I worked in South Africa for well over a year during the height of apartheid, and these are precisely the tactics. Maybe they were called different names, but precisely the tactics that the Afrikaners used to corral black people, or quote, colored people. So it was quite alarming and disturbing for me to see that. And and obviously more disturbing to see the U.S. Pay for it.
That's a good point, James. That would be interesting to ask Gideon. You said earlier that you feel that most Israelis really have no idea what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. But within Israel itself, the situation for Palestinian Israelis, Muslim and Christian, is extremely, I would think some people call it a third-class situation, with substandard schools, without the ability to move back to their homes they were pushed out of in 1948, a very subclass living situation for Palestinians within Israel itself. How many Israelis recognize that?
We must draw a very clear line between the Palestinians who live under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza and the Israeli Arabs, as they are called in Israel, the Israeli Palestinians. The Israeli Palestinians gain many more basic civil rights. They carry Israeli passports. They vote for the Israeli parliament. They have full freedom of movement. They are discriminated, but they are discriminated in terms of economy, in terms of equal rights, but not in terms of basic human rights or civil rights like their fellow Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The two communities, the Jewish community and the Palestinian community living in Israel, are getting more and more separated. They are living in their towns and cities, and the Jews are living in their towns and cities. You see more and more signs of racism toward them, but still their struggle is about equality, about budgets, about economy. It's not like their fellow Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, whose struggle is about self-determination, about freedom, about much more basic things.
We have now another caller, Ellen from Medford.
Hi, Mr. Levy. I admire your writing, and I am a journalist too. And I just spent a month in the West Bank. When I was in East Jerusalem, I went out to dinner. I visited the American Colony Hotel where I used to stay on journalist discount for $10 a night 30 years ago. And I noticed that prices are just skyrocketing. They are through the roof. And I wanted to know what this has to do with the Judaization of East Jerusalem, whether you've written anything about developers who are involved in the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem. Recently I wrote something and mentioned Lev Leviev, whom you know, because he finances numbers of settlements in the West Bank.
First of all, I'm not a real expert for Jerusalem. I spent much more time in the hardcore places, in Jenin, in Nablus, in Hebron, in Gaza. I can tell you that the prices raised in East Jerusalem because it is peaceful now there, because more and more tourists are coming over. I wouldn't see a line between this and the Judaization, as you call it, of East Jerusalem, because basically East Jerusalem is still and will be for many years Palestinians. The fact that settlers are penetrating there will not change the fact that basically it is a Palestinian city, East Jerusalem, El-Quds, and the prices raises out of economy. More and more tourists are coming, as I said. When times are more peaceful, like in the last years, there is more demand. Also, the economical situation in the entire West Bank improved in the last years. I don't think that this is a solution, but this must be admitted that in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, in Hebron, in Nablus, everywhere, economy is improving in the last few years because there is some kind of stability and some kind of silence, but this will not last long if there will not be a political solution.
May I ask you a related question? Have you yourself reported on the extent of building by Palestinians within towns and villages in the West Bank? And is a comment that I made in a recent article that I published that Israel does not mainly permit Palestinians to build into the countryside correct?
It's all true. I mean, the Palestinians are really, in the West Bank, in most of the areas, totally stuck because they can't get permissions to build, and then when they build without permission, their houses are being demolished. This is an old story, not from today. It's already many, many years so, and it creates a lot of tragedies.
What I'm wondering about, and I would love to have you discuss, is the role of religion in Israel. In many cases, I think it plays very little of a part. This is a colonial project, and I think probably the listeners to this show understand that aspect. But there certainly is a religious aspect. It goes across the gamut. On the one hand, you have these extremist religious settlers who are among the most violent and ruthless and are basing their actions, they claim, on the Talmud. On the other hand, you have Jewish fundamentalists who are very anti-Zionist, who believe that Zionism is profoundly heretical. Then you have another component that I know little about, which is the Israeli peace camp. I understand is political and usually leftist, for example. How many of those people do you feel are motivated by their own version of Judaism and by religious, spiritual beliefs?
It's a complicated question because the situation is so complex. I can only refer you to an article I published today, and you can read it in Haaretz website, dealing exactly with this question. Namely, I claim that Israel is much more religious than usually it is being presented. I think there are only 3 states today in the world where religion is not separated from the state, namely Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So basically we are dealing with a half theocracy or maybe more than this, and it's very easy to prove it. As you know, you can't marry in Israel without rabbinite institutions. I mean, you don't have civil marriage, you don't have civil divorce, you hardly have civil funerals. Israel is more religious than it seems, more religious than most of us want to be seen. The majority of Israelis claim that they are secular, but when you really judge it, you see that in each of them there is something religious, so almost at each of them. Only 44% of the Israelis claim they are secular, and even they are not really seculars. While in Sweden, for example, 64% of the population claim they are atheists. So Israel is much, much more religious than it seems. And the whole raison d'etre of the Zionistic movement is based on religious justifications, on religion, on the Bible. Nobody can deny it. We are in the land of Israel because of the Bible, which is a religious text, as you know. We are now in Palestinian Hebron because of the Bible. We are now in Palestinian Nablus because of the Bible. All the settlements, most of them carry biblical names.
Gideon, I have a quick question to you. In the course of this program, I've said your name as Levy and as Levy. Could you let me know which it is?
None of them and both of them. You feel yourself free to call me anyway.
Well, I guess I'll try to do something right in the middle. You were talking about religion, and I had to cut you off. If you'd like to go with that a little further.
Yeah, I just want to say that Israel is more of a theocracy than it seems. Israel is more religious than Israelis want to see themselves. Religion is very, very important. It's basic from the first days of Zionism. Nobody can deny it. We are here because of biblical reasons. And the occupation has a lot of religious justifications. Having said all this, I would like to insist that dispute between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Jews and the Muslims, until now does not have a clear religious character. It is still a national dispute, a dispute about real estate, a dispute about a piece of land. It does not carry yet very clear religious motivations, even though those are becoming stronger and stronger in the last years.
Yes, and of course there are the Palestinian Christians that are part of this dispute as well, and yet thank you for discussing that, because I look forward to reading your column. I haven't read it yet today. Could you just quickly tell me your views and whether you ever met Israel Shahak? the Israeli professor who wrote a few books about the religious aspect of Israel and of the settlers and about Judaism in general.
Unfortunately, Professor Shahak is not with us already for many years, and I was too young and too brainwashed and too much in the mainstream when he was still alive, so I never had the privilege to meet him. I know his books. He was courageous, much more courageous than I am, because he was really a single voice in much harder times, but he's not with us for many years already.
Well, with us we have a caller from Eugene, Oregon.
Thank you for taking my call. My name is Mariah. Mr. Levy is correct when he speaks about the discrimination against the Palestinian Arab Israeli citizens within so-called Israel proper. However, he omits that this discrimination comes from the top down. There are over 20 laws that discriminate against this segment, approximately 20% of the population, in every area of life. For the benefit of your readers, there are 2 books that they can check out and read on this in detail. One is by Susan Mason. The Other Side of Israel is her book. She's a Jewish woman who decided to go and live on the Arab side. The other one is Jonathan Cook, Blood and Religion, The Unmasking of the Jewish and Democratic State. And when people understand the nature of this kind of segregation and discrimination, they realize that only the one-state solution, one democratic state solution, would meet the human rights needs and requirements of all 3 groups of the Palestinian people, the citizens within Israel proper, the people in the occupied territories, and the Palestinian refugee and diaspora.
Gideon, would you like to address both a little bit more about the situation of Palestinians in Israel itself? And I also was going to ask you about your view. Increasing numbers of Americans working on this issue feel that the just and lasting solution is some type of one-state solution with equal rights for everyone, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity.
I would love to have a one-state solution. I would love to live in an equal and just state where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews, Muslims, and Christians will be equally treated, will have equal rights. I would love to see all this happening, but unfortunately, I'm not sure that this is possible. Emotions are very, very deep. Fears are very rooted. And above all, I'm afraid that this one-state solution will become another apartheid state, because the Jews and the Israelis will hold all the positions with power in the army, in politics, in economy, in science, you name it. It will take generations until the Palestinian society, who is still struggling for independence and still has many problems of its own, domestic, built-in problems, freedom of the women, religion, other problems. It will take a lot of time until the 2 societies will be in the same place. Until then, we might face an apartheid state, and this none of us want. So theoretically, the one-state solution is the most just solution for this ongoing problem. I'm not sure this is the time for it. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we are not too late about the 2-state solution. I don't see any Israeli leader evacuating 300,000 or 500,000 settlers, and without this, there will be no viable Palestinian state.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our program. It's been very valuable having you with us. I certainly hope that we can have you again. And I'd like to say that many of us would love to have your column in U.S. newspapers. It would be a major contribution. Do you have hope for the future? I know that I do. It's hard to maintain that at times, but do you have any hope at all? And if so, how do you think change will come?
I have very little hope, and I'm realistic enough to believe in miracles. And I'm realistic enough to believe in miracles. And I'm realistic